Charlotte Graham adjusted the crisp scarf tied neatly around her neck and smoothed the hem of her navy blue blazer. At 53, she was a woman of routine. For 15 years, she had walked the aisles of Airline's first-class cabins with the practiced grace of someone who had mastered the art of discretion. She was not just a flight attendant, she was the guardian of a certain standard. A quiet arbiter of who belonged. It was a role she took seriously. As passengers began boarding Flight 721 to Paris, Charlotte stood at the front of the plane, scanning each face with a practiced eye. There were the usual suspects, a silver-haired couple clutching passports and designer carry-ons, a trio of well-dressed executives murmuring in low tones, and a glamorous young woman balancing a lapdog in one arm and a glass of champagne in the other. They fit. And then there was the family. They arrived without fanfare, moving efficiently through the narrow aisles as though they had done this before. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, wore a tailored navy suit with understated confidence. His wife, elegant in a simple dress, held the hands of two children, a boy and a girl, both dressed in tidy, well-fitted clothing. The children moved quietly, their wide eyes taking in the luxury around them with the wonder of innocence. For a moment, Charlotte's gaze lingered on the man's boarding pass, 1G, first class. She noted the same for his wife and children. Her lips pressed together in a thin line. The Turners, she thought. To most, they might seem like any other affluent family embarking on a journey abroad. But to Charlotte, there was something about them that caught her attention, not their attire or their manner, but something deeper, something unspoken. It wasn't the kind of thing you could put into words. It was just a feeling. "Excuse me," Charlotte said, her tone carefully polite but firm as the family reached her. "Could you step aside for a moment? I need to confirm your reservation." The man, Darius Turner, stopped and turned to her with a calm, steady expression. His wife, Naomi, glanced at him briefly before stepping slightly in front of their children. "Is there an issue?" Darius asked, his voice measured, without a trace of impatience. Charlotte didn't answer immediately. Instead, she scanned their tickets again, though she had already seen that they were valid. "It seems there's been some confusion," she said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Behind them, the line of boarding passengers began to grow restless. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Charlotte directed the family to wait near the side of the cabin. The seconds stretched into minutes. Other first-class passengers filed past, some glancing curiously at the Turners, others pretending not to notice. Charlotte, meanwhile, disappeared into the galley to confer with her colleague, Sarah, a younger flight attendant with wide, uncertain eyes. "You saw the family in row 1G?" Charlotte asked, lowering her voice. Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the Turners. "Yes. They seem nice?" Charlotte's lips tightened. "Nice isn't the issue," she replied, her tone clipped. "First class is exclusive. Sarah, you can't just assume." She stopped herself. "Assume what?" Sarah asked carefully, though there was a faint edge in her voice. Charlotte waved her off. "Never mind. I'll handle it." When she returned to the Turners, her demeanor had shifted. The practiced warmth she usually extended to first-class passengers was replaced by a cool formality. "Please follow me," she said, her tone brisk. But instead of leading them to their assigned seats near the front of the cabin, Charlotte directed them to a row at the back of first class, near the partition that separated premium seating from the rest of the plane. It was a subtle move but intentional, a quiet demotion from the best seats in the house. Darius said nothing, though his jaw tightened slightly as he guided his family into their new seats. Naomi's hand rested lightly on her daughter's shoulder as she settled in, her calm demeanor unbroken. Charlotte felt a faint sense of satisfaction as she returned to her duties, convinced that she had restored a sense of order. But as the plane climbed into the sky, her eyes kept drifting back to the Turners. They weren't loud or demanding. In fact, they were quieter than most. The children read books, and Naomi helped her son color in a small activity pad. Darius leaned back in his seat, a hardcover novel resting in his lap. And yet, their presence unsettled her. Charlotte couldn't say why. It wasn't anything they had done, it was just a feeling. The kind of instinct she had honed over years of experience. First class was a space she had helped define. A sanctuary of refinement and privilege. The Turners, no matter how well dressed or polite, felt like an anomaly. And for Charlotte, anomalies were a problem to solve. As the flight progressed, she found herself checking on them less often than she did the other passengers. The man in 1A received his wine promptly. The couple in 2C and 2D had their dessert plates cleared with a smile. But when the Turners pressed their call button to request water for their daughter, it took longer than usual for anyone to respond. In the galley, Sarah noticed but said nothing. The man in the sharp suit, Michael Lawson, seated just a few rows ahead, noticed too. And though neither the Turners nor the other passengers said a word, Charlotte began to feel an uneasy weight settling in her chest. By the time the cabin lights dimmed for the overnight portion of the flight, Charlotte was no longer sure what exactly she had been trying to prove. But it didn't matter. The lines had already been drawn, and the quiet tension hanging in the air was something she couldn't take back. As the plane sailed over the Atlantic, Charlotte turned her focus to the tasks that remained: preparing for landing, checking seat belts, and ensuring that the pristine facade of first class remained intact. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping beyond her control. The gentle hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane leveled at cruising altitude. Outside, the vast expanse of clouds stretched endlessly, unbroken and serene. Inside, however, the atmosphere was far less tranquil. The quiet hum of conversations, the occasional clink of glasses, and the faint glow of reading lights masked a subtle tension brewing in the back row of first class. Charlotte Graham moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, her polished smile firmly in place. The rituals of service: pouring champagne, presenting menus, adjusting blankets, were her comfort. A rhythm she had perfected over years of flying. But tonight, her focus faltered, pulled repeatedly toward the Turners. They sat quietly, as if deliberately trying not to draw attention to themselves. Darius had opened his book, though he seemed to be reading more slowly than usual, occasionally glancing at his wife. Naomi occupied herself with their children, who were surprisingly well behaved for their age. The little girl had nodded off, her head resting against her mother's arm, while her brother contentedly colored in a travel activity book. From the outside, they seemed like any other family. And yet, Charlotte couldn't stop thinking about them. In truth, it wasn't the Turners themselves that unsettled her, it was what they represented. First class was a space defined by quiet rules, unspoken but deeply understood. The polished shoes, the tailored suits, the effortless ease with which passengers like the silver-haired couple in row 1 carried themselves, all of it spoke to a certain expectation of who belonged. Charlotte had spent years enforcing those expectations, her intuition fine-tuned to detect even the slightest disruption to the order. And the Turners, despite their impeccable manners and reserved demeanor, felt like a disruption. She couldn't say why. It wasn't their clothing, which was subdued but elegant, nor was it their behavior, which was far more composed than some of the other first-class passengers she had dealt with. Perhaps it was something about their stillness, a quiet but unyielding presence that felt out of place in a cabin filled with the chatter of wealth and ease. Charlotte tried to push the thoughts aside as she returned to the galley, where Sarah was arranging dessert plates. The younger flight attendant looked up as Charlotte entered, her face a mix of nervousness and curiosity. "Everything okay out there?" Sarah asked, her voice tentative. Charlotte hesitated before answering. "It's fine," she said curtly, reaching for the tray of plates. But after a moment, she added, "That family in row 3. You noticed them, right?" Sarah nodded. "The Turners? What about them?" Charlotte lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the galley. "Doesn't it feel off, them being here?" Sarah blinked, surprised. "Off? No, I don't think so. They seem nice, polite, even." Charlotte sighed, placing the tray down with more force than she intended. "First class isn't cheap, Sarah. You don't just end up here without connections. And they don't exactly look like." She stopped herself, but the implication hung heavily in the air. Sarah's brows furrowed. "They have first-class tickets," she said carefully. "Doesn't that mean they belong here?" Charlotte didn't answer. Instead, she straightened her blazer and picked up the tray, leaving Sarah behind with a growing unease of her own. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As the flight continued, the disparity in service grew more apparent. Drinks arrived promptly for the other passengers, the Turners waited. Dessert was served with warm smiles to the couple in row 1. The Turners received theirs without a word. And yet, they said nothing. Naomi's expression remained calm, though her eyes betrayed a quiet awareness of the situation. Darius, too, seemed to notice, but he stayed focused on his book, his jaw tightening slightly whenever a flight attendant passed without stopping. Charlotte watched them from a distance, her chest tightening with a feeling she couldn't quite name. It wasn't guilt, not yet, but it was something close, a faint discomfort at the way they absorbed the slights without complaint. The man in the sharp suit, Michael Lawson, had noticed as well, seated 2 rows ahead of the Turners. He had been quietly observing the dynamics of the cabin. At first, he seemed merely curious, but as the flight wore on, his expression hardened. When dessert was finally served to the Turners, Michael flagged down Sarah as she passed by. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm. "Why was their service delayed?" Sarah froze, her tray balanced precariously in her hands. I'm not sure, sir," she stammered, glancing toward Charlotte, who was busy attending to another passenger. Michael raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You should find out," he said simply, turning back to his meal. Sarah retreated quickly, her steps hurried as she disappeared into the galley. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully on the surface, but the tension in the cabin lingered like an unseen weight. Charlotte avoided looking at the Turners as she completed her rounds, focusing instead on the passengers who fit more comfortably into her mental picture of first class. But as the cabin lights dimmed and the plane settled into the quiet stillness of an overnight flight, Charlotte found herself glancing back at them again. Darius and Naomi sat side by side, their hands brushing occasionally as they adjusted their children's blankets. They weren't whispering or exchanging knowing glances, they weren't doing anything to make themselves noticed. And yet, their presence felt like a quiet challenge, an unspoken question that Charlotte didn't know how to answer. As she stood in the galley, pretending to busy herself with paperwork, Charlotte overheard Sarah talking quietly to one of the other attendants. "I don't get it," Sarah was saying. "They're not doing anything wrong. Why are we treating them differently?" Charlotte didn't respond, but the question lodged itself in her mind, repeating itself like an echo. She didn't have an answer. And for the first time that evening, she began to wonder if the unease she felt wasn't about the Turners at all but about herself. The plane began its slow descent into Paris, the cabin filled with the soft rustle of passengers gathering their belongings and preparing for arrival. Outside, the dark expanse of the Atlantic gave way to the glittering lights of the French countryside, a sight that usually filled Charlotte Graham with a sense of quiet satisfaction. But tonight, there was no comfort to be found in the routine. Charlotte moved mechanically through her tasks, her polished demeanor intact but her thoughts unsettled. She reminded herself of the usual checklists: trays collected, seat belts fastened, announcements made, and yet, her gaze kept drifting to the back row of first class, where the Turners sat calmly, their children leaning sleepily against their parents. For most passengers, the approach to Paris was a time of anticipation, a chance to think ahead to the city's promise of beauty and culture. For Charlotte, it felt more like the closing act of an uncomfortable play. Her unease had grown throughout the flight, a subtle but persistent weight pressing on her. The Turners had not complained. Not once, despite the slow service and the subtle coldness they had received. And somehow, their quiet dignity made it worse. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As the plane touched down with a soft jolt, Charlotte's professional instincts kicked in. She busied herself ensuring that the cabin was secure, her movements quick and efficient. The passengers in row 1 exchanged pleasantries with her as they prepared to disembark, their gratitude warm but routine. But when she approached the Turners, she found herself hesitating. "Thank you for flying with us," Charlotte said, her voice carefully neutral. Darius Turner paused, looking at her directly for the first time since the flight began. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a depth that unsettled her. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone polite but firm. Naomi nodded, her expression unreadable. "Good evening," she said quietly, guiding her children toward the aisle. For a moment, Charlotte felt as though the exchange had ended, the moment passing without incident. But then Darius glanced back. Just briefly, his gaze sweeping over the first-class cabin before returning to her. It wasn't a glare or a reprimand, just a glance. And yet it left her with the distinct impression that something had been left unsaid. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The passengers filed out in a steady stream, the cabin slowly emptying until only the crew remained. Charlotte exhaled, relieved to be free from the Turners' silent presence. She began tidying up, grateful for the distraction of routine. But just as she folded the last blanket, one of the junior attendants appeared at her side. "Charlotte," she said hesitantly, her voice low, "the captain wants to see you in the cockpit." Charlotte's heart sank. "Now?" The attendant nodded. He said, "It's important." Blank. Underscore. Blank. The walk to the cockpit felt longer than it should have, the narrow aisle stretching endlessly ahead of her. Charlotte forced herself to keep her composure, smoothing her blazer and lifting her chin. Whatever this was, she told herself, it would be dealt with swiftly and professionally. When she stepped into the cockpit, the captain, an experienced, even-tempered man named Henry Marks, was waiting, his expression unusually serious. "Charlotte," he said, gesturing to the jump seat. "Take a seat." She obeyed, her posture stiff. "Is there a problem, Captain?" Marks folded his hands in front of him, his tone measured but firm. "We've received a message from corporate," he began, his words deliberate. "It concerns the passengers in row 3, Darius and Naomi Turner." Charlotte felt a flicker of unease but remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "They're not just passengers," Marks said, watching her closely. "They're the majority stakeholders in Aureus Airlines." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. For a moment, Charlotte couldn't comprehend what he had said. Stakeholders? Owners? The Turners? "They've been conducting an incognito evaluation of first-class service," Marks continued, "and from the report I've received, their experience on this flight was less than satisfactory." Charlotte's throat tightened, her carefully constructed composure threatening to crack. "I wasn't aware," she began, but Marks cut her off. "That's the problem," he said sharply. "You weren't aware because you didn't treat them with the same respect you showed the other passengers. And now, we're facing a formal complaint." Blank. Underscore. Blank. The rest of the conversation blurred together in Charlotte's mind, the details fading beneath the weight of what she had just learned. The Turners, owners of the very airline she had served for 15 years, had been sitting in the back row of first class, quietly observing everything, and she had failed them. By the time Marks finished speaking, Charlotte could barely meet his gaze. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've requested a meeting," Marks said simply, "before they leave the airport." Blank. Underscore. Blank. The VIP lounge was quiet, its plush chairs and subdued lighting a stark contrast to the sterile bustle of the terminal outside. Charlotte stood just outside the glass doors, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her blazer for the third time. Inside, Darius and Naomi Turner sat side by side, their postures relaxed but commanding. Their children were nowhere in sight, leaving the couple fully focused on what lay ahead. The captain's voice broke through her thoughts. "They're waiting for you." Charlotte nodded, stepping forward with leaden feet. As the glass doors slid open, she felt the weight of their gaze on her, calm but unyielding. For the first time in her career, Charlotte felt truly powerless, and as she approached the Turners, the words she had so carefully rehearsed evaporated, leaving her with nothing but the silent truth of what she had done. The door to the VIP lounge closed softly behind Charlotte, the sound swallowed by the room's muted ambiance. Inside, the quiet was almost tangible, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. The Turners sat on one side of a low glass table, their postures composed yet commanding. Charlotte stood before them, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, unsure of what to do next. "Have a seat," Darius Turner said, his voice calm but firm. Charlotte hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair across from them. The cushion felt too soft, as though it might swallow her whole. Naomi Turner sat upright, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Her expression was unreadable, though her eyes, sharp and steady, left no room for misinterpretation. Darius, beside her, leaned back slightly, his gaze measured. There was no anger, no theatrics, just a quiet expectation. Charlotte opened her mouth, but no words came. She had rehearsed what she might say during the long walk from the cockpit. But now, under their gaze, her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. Finally, Naomi broke the silence. "Ms. Graham," she began, her tone even. "Do you know why we're here?" Charlotte swallowed hard. I understand there were issues during the flight," she said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "Issues," Naomi repeated, her brow lifting slightly. She exchanged a glance with Darius, who said nothing. Charlotte shifted uncomfortably, her hands tightening in her lap. "I want to apologize for any misunderstandings," she continued, her words stumbling over themselves. "It wasn't my intention to." Darius raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Let's not start with intentions," he said quietly. "Let's start with actions." His words landed with the weight of a gavel. Charlotte felt her face flush as the reality of the situation pressed down on her. "You made assumptions about us," Naomi said, her voice still calm but firm. "From the moment we stepped onto that plane. You decided we didn't belong. You didn't say it outright, but your actions spoke louder than words." Charlotte wanted to protest, to explain, but the words caught in her throat. "You delayed our service," Naomi continued, her tone unwavering. "You seated us at the back of first class, away from the other passengers. You avoided us throughout the flight. Yet you had no problem attending to everyone else. Tell me, Ms. Graham, why is that?" Charlotte faltered, her voice breaking. She forced herself to meet Naomi's gaze, but it felt like standing under the weight of a judge's gavel. "I don't know," she admitted finally. Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't you?" The question lingered in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Blank. Blank. For a moment, the room was silent. Charlotte stared at the glass table between them, unable to look either of them in the eye. She felt exposed, as though every unspoken thought she had buried during the flight had been dragged into the light. Darius leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Ms. Graham," he began, his voice calm but deliberate. "We didn't come here to humiliate you. This isn't about revenge or making a scene. But it is about accountability." Charlotte nodded mutely, her throat too tight to speak. "We've encountered people like you before," Naomi said, her tone softening but losing none of its firmness. "People who think they're being subtle. People who think they're justified. And we've learned not to let it slide. We're not just passengers," Darius added. "We're the majority stakeholders in Aureus Airlines. And what happened on that flight reflects poorly not just on you, but on the company as a whole." Charlotte's head snapped up, her heart sinking further. She had known this meeting would be bad, but hearing the words out loud made it feel unbearable. "This isn't just about us," Naomi continued. "It's about what your behavior represents. How many other passengers have you treated like this? How many others have walked away from one of your flights feeling like they didn't belong, even though they had every right to be there?" Charlotte opened her mouth to respond, but once again, no words came. Blank. Darius leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. "You've been with this airline for a long time, haven't you?" he asked. "Yes," Charlotte said quietly. 15 years. "Then you've had plenty of time to learn what this job is really about," he said. "And yet, here we are." The words stung, but Charlotte forced herself to nod. "We're going to file a formal report with corporate," Darius said. "They'll decide what happens next. But I need you to understand something. This isn't just about your job. It's about how you choose to carry yourself. Not just as a flight attendant, but as a person." Naomi stood, smoothing the fabric of her dress. Her expression was calm, but there was a faint edge of disappointment in her eyes. "What you do with this moment is up to you," she said. "But if nothing changes, then this conversation was a waste of time." Darius rose as well, extending a hand toward Charlotte. She hesitated for a moment before shaking it, her grip tentative and uncertain. "Good luck," he said simply. Blank. Blank. As the Turners left the lounge, Charlotte remained seated, her hands trembling in her lap. The quiet hum of the room pressed down on her like a weight, amplifying the silence they left behind. For the first time in her career, Charlotte Graham felt utterly lost. And as she sat there, staring at the empty doorway, she realized that the person she had been at the start of the flight no longer existed. The drive home from the airport felt both mercifully short and endlessly long. Charlotte Graham gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale against the soft leather. The quiet hum of the car's engine filled the silence, a sound that should have been soothing but instead felt oppressive. The words of Darius and Naomi Turner echoed in her mind, weaving themselves into an unshakable rhythm. "You decided we didn't belong. What your behavior represents. How many others?" The road ahead blurred slightly as Charlotte blinked back tears she refused to let fall. She had spent the past 15 years of her life cultivating an image of competence and professionalism. She had prided herself on her ability to handle any situation with grace and control. And now, that carefully constructed image lay in ruins. Blank. At home, the silence was heavier than the hum of the car, heavier than the quiet of the lounge. Charlotte dropped her bag by the door and stood in the entryway for a moment, staring at nothing in particular. The house, usually her sanctuary, felt unfamiliar. She went to the kitchen, filling a glass with water but not drinking it. Her reflection in the window above the sink caught her eye in neat bun. A crisp uniform, the face of a woman who had built her identity around the illusion of perfection. For years, Charlotte had told herself that her instincts were a strength. She trusted her judgment, believed in her ability to read people and situations. She had convinced herself that her quick decisions were rooted in experience, not bias. But now, she wasn't so sure. Blank. She sat down at the small dining table, staring at the glass of water in front of her. Her mind drifted to the Turners, their calm expressions, the quiet strength in their voices. They hadn't raised their voices, hadn't accused her of anything outright. And yet, their words had carried a weight that no amount of defensiveness could deflect. It wasn't just what they said, it was the truth behind it. For the first time, Charlotte allowed herself to sit with the uncomfortable realization that her actions during the flight weren't just mistakes. They were part of a pattern, a series of decisions shaped by assumptions she had never questioned. How many other passengers, she wondered, had felt her quiet judgment without ever saying a word? How many had left her flights with the same feeling the Turners had described, a sense that they didn't belong, even when they had every right to be there? Blank. The next morning, Charlotte woke early, her body restless despite the lack of sleep. The house was quiet, the faint light of dawn spilling through the curtains. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone. A part of her wanted to bury the entire experience, to move forward without looking back. But another part of her, the part that remembered Naomi's sharp but steady gaze, knew that wasn't an option. She opened a search engine, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing. Unconscious bias training. The results flooded the screen: articles, studies, workshops, books. Charlotte scrolled through them, her eyes scanning titles and summaries. Each one felt like a small step forward, a crack in the wall she had built around herself. Blank. Over the next few days, Charlotte began reading. The material was uncomfortable, each page forcing her to confront parts of herself she had long ignored. She read about the history of bias in professional spaces, the subtle ways it manifested, the harm it caused even when it wasn't intentional. One article, in particular, struck a chord. It described a concept she hadn't considered before: the banality of exclusion. The idea that prejudice often didn't look like open hostility, but rather like the small, unspoken actions that pushed people to the margins. Charlotte thought of the Turners sitting in the back of first class, their service delayed, their presence quietly questioned. She thought of the way she had dismissed them without ever realizing she was doing it. By the end of the week, Charlotte had read more than she thought possible. But it didn't feel like enough. She needed to do more than read, she needed to act. She scrolled through her phone, hesitating before landing on a number she hadn't dialed in months: her younger sister. Evelyn. Evelyn had spent years working as a diversity consultant, a role Charlotte had quietly dismissed as unnecessary and overly political. Now, she realized how wrong she had been. The phone rang twice before Evelyn answered. Charlotte? Her voice was cautious, surprised. Hi, Charlotte said, her voice trembling slightly. I know it's been a while. But I need to talk to you. About something important. There was a pause on the other end, long enough for Charlotte to wonder if Evelyn might hang up. But then she spoke, her tone softening. Okay, Evelyn said. I'm listening. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Charlotte didn't hold back. For the first time, she allowed herself to be honest, not just about what had happened on the flight, but about the years of assumptions and judgments that had led to that moment. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her silence patient and attentive. When Charlotte finally finished, her voice hoarse from emotion, there was another pause. That's a lot to unpack, Evelyn said finally, her tone thoughtful. But it's a good start. Charlotte exhaled, the tension in her chest easing slightly. I don't know what to do next, she admitted. I feel lost. You start by learning, Evelyn said gently. By listening. By doing the hard work to understand what you didn't before. It's not going to be easy, Charlotte, but it's possible. Blank. Underscore. Blank. After the call ended, Charlotte sat in the quiet of her living room, feeling both overwhelmed and strangely hopeful. For the first time, she felt a small but genuine sense of direction. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing. She couldn't go back to being the person she had been before. And perhaps, she thought, that was enough. For now. The email arrived just after sunrise. Its subject line concise but weighty. Next steps. Addressing bias in professional environments. Charlotte Graham opened it with a mix of apprehension and determination. It was a follow-up to a workshop series she had signed up for after her conversation with Evelyn. One aimed at helping professionals confront and unlearn the subtle biases that shaped their decisions. Her first assignment was clear. Reflect on the moments in her career where her instincts might have been wrong, when her assumptions had guided her actions in ways she hadn't questioned. Charlotte sat at her dining table, staring at the blinking cursor on her laptop. The task seemed deceptively simple. But every time she tried to start, her mind balked. How could she condense years of unexamined behaviors into a single narrative? How could she admit, even to herself, the ways she had fallen short? The Turners' faces floated to the forefront of her mind. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The workshop itself was virtual, held via a video platform that connected participants from across the country. Charlotte logged in hesitantly, her name appearing in a small square among a grid of faces, some stoic, others curious, all silently observing each other. The facilitator, a poised woman named Dr. Valerie Hart, began by setting the tone. Her voice was calm, deliberate. This space isn't about blame, she said. It's about understanding. Bias isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes, it's the quiet decisions we make without realizing their impact. Our goal here is to learn how to recognize those moments and choose differently moving forward. Charlotte felt a flicker of relief. It wasn't absolution she was looking for, she didn't expect that, but the idea of moving forward, of choosing differently, felt like a lifeline. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The first session focused on listening. Participants were asked to simply observe as others shared their experiences, both as those who had been on the receiving end of bias and those who had perpetuated it. The stories were varied. A young professional whose name had been mispronounced at work for years. A teacher who realized she had been calling on boys more than girls in her classroom. A manager who admitted to avoiding difficult conversations with employees who didn't look like him. Charlotte sat silently, her notebook open but untouched. She didn't know what to write. Then a woman spoke, her voice steady but laced with emotion. It's not always what someone says, the woman began. Sometimes, it's what they don't say. It's the glance that lingers too long. The service that's just a little slower. The questions that never get asked. It's the small things that add up to tell you. You don't belong here. Charlotte's chest tightened. She thought of Naomi Turner's steady gaze, her quiet composure, and the pointed words she had spoken in the lounge. She wrote one line in her notebook. What have my silences said? Blank. Underscore. Blank. The sessions continued over the next few weeks, each one peeling back another layer of understanding. Charlotte learned about the history of systemic bias in workplaces, the ways it had been woven into policies and practices, and the unconscious habits that perpetuated it. She also learned about the cost not just to those who experienced it but to those who perpetuated it. Bias, Dr. Hart explained, didn't just harm relationships, it narrowed perspectives, robbing individuals of the opportunity to grow. Charlotte thought about the years she had spent as a flight attendant, the countless passengers she had interacted with. How many opportunities had she missed to connect, to learn, to treat someone better simply because she had allowed her assumptions to dictate her actions? Blank. Underscore. Blank. One night, after a particularly reflective session, Charlotte decided to take a walk. The streets were quiet, the air crisp with the faint scent of autumn leaves. She passed a park where children's laughter echoed faintly, a sound both comforting and distant. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to think about the Turners without the weight of guilt clouding her mind. Instead, she thought about what they had shown her, not through anger or confrontation, but through their quiet dignity. She pulled out her phone and opened a blank note. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Turner, she began, then paused. The words didn't come easily, but she kept writing. She thanked them for their honesty, for holding her accountable in a way that had forced her to reflect deeply. She apologized not just for what had happened on the flight but for the broader implications of her actions, the ways they had contributed to something much larger than a single mistake. By the time she finished, the letter was far from perfect, but it was honest. She saved it, unsure if she would ever send it. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Over time, Charlotte began to notice small changes in herself. She was more deliberate in her interactions, more willing to pause and question her assumptions. She sought out voices she hadn't listened to before, reading books and essays that challenged her worldview. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the work felt overwhelming, when the weight of her mistakes threatened to pull her back into defensiveness or shame. But each time, she reminded herself of what Evelyn had said: it's not about being perfect. It's about being better. Blank. Underscore. Blank. One day, as she prepared for another workshop, an email arrived from the facilitator. The Turners had read her letter. Their response was brief but kind, acknowledging her effort and encouraging her to continue the work she had started. Charlotte reread the email several times, her chest tightening with a mixture of relief and determination. The journey ahead was still long, but for the first time, she felt as though she was moving in the right direction. And that, she thought, was enough. Charlotte Graham adjusted her blazer as she stepped into the meeting room of the local community center. It wasn't the kind of space she was used to. No polished chrome or leather seats, no hushed tones of executive precision. The room was simple, its folding chairs arranged in a wide circle, sunlight streaming through large windows that overlooked a small garden. It was her first day volunteering with Pathways to Equity, a nonprofit focused on workplace inclusivity. A few months ago, the idea of stepping into this room would have felt foreign to her, even unnecessary. Now, it felt like the next step in a path she was still learning how to walk. The director of the program, an energetic woman named Angela Davis, greeted Charlotte warmly. Angela had been the one to accept Charlotte's offer to volunteer after they'd spoken on the phone. At the time, Charlotte had hesitated, unsure if her skills as a flight attendant could translate into anything meaningful. But Angela had been reassuring. We need people who've been on both sides of this issue, she had said. Your perspective could make a real difference here. Charlotte wasn't sure she believed her, but she was here anyway. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The first session was focused on training, a mix of discussion, role-playing, and reflection. Most of the participants were younger, professionals working in fields as varied as tech, education, and retail. They were here because they wanted to change the cultures of their workplaces or like Charlotte, because they wanted to change themselves. Angela stood at the front, her voice calm but firm as she set the tone. The work we do here isn't about fixing anyone, she said. It's about seeing more clearly. About understanding how our actions, even the small ones, can ripple outward. The group nodded, some murmuring quiet agreement. Charlotte sat quietly, taking it in. The exercises began with something simple. Participants were asked to recall a moment when they felt excluded, even unintentionally. As people began to share, the room filled with a quiet hum of vulnerability. A man in his 30s talked about being passed over for promotions despite his qualifications. A woman described the pain of being mistaken for the receptionist in her own office. Their voices were calm, not bitter, but the weight of their experiences was palpable. When it was Charlotte's turn, she hesitated. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Angela stepped in gently. "Take your time," she said. Charlotte cleared her throat. "I don't have a story about being excluded," she began, "but I do have a story about making someone feel excluded." The room grew even quieter. She described the flight, the turners, and the choices she had made. She didn't sugarcoat it or try to justify her actions. She spoke plainly, her voice steady but low. "When I look back," she said, "what strikes me most isn't what I did, but what I didn't do. I didn't see them, not really, and because of that, I failed them." When she finished, no one spoke right away. Then Angela nodded. "Thank you for sharing that," she said. "It takes courage to admit when we've fallen short." Charlotte nodded, unsure of what else to say. But as the session continued, she felt something shift not just in the room, but within herself. Blank. Underscore. Blank. In the weeks that followed, Charlotte began taking on small projects for Pathways to Equity. At first, it was administrative work, updating documents, organizing workshop schedules, but soon, Angela began asking her to participate in the training sessions themselves. "You have a story people need to hear," Angela said one day, "and you tell it in a way that makes people listen." Charlotte wasn't sure about that, but she agreed anyway. Her first time speaking in front of a group was nerve-wracking. She stumbled over her words, her hands trembling slightly as she held her notes. But as she looked at the faces in the room, she remembered what Evelyn had told her. It's not about being perfect. It's about being better. By the end of the session, she felt something she hadn't felt in months, a quiet sense of purpose. Blank. Underscore. Blank. One afternoon, Charlotte found herself sitting across from a young woman named Mia, who had come to the nonprofit seeking advice. Mia worked as a manager at a small tech startup and was struggling to address issues of bias within her team. "I'm afraid of making it worse," Mia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I say the wrong thing?" Charlotte listened carefully before responding. "It's not about saying everything perfectly," she said. "It's about showing that you're willing to listen and learn. People can sense when you're genuine. That matters more than getting it right every time." Mia nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thank you," she said. "That helps." As Mia left the room, Charlotte felt a small spark of pride, not in herself, but in the realization that she could take what she had learned and use it to help someone else. Blank. Underscore. Blank. One evening, as Charlotte prepared to leave the center, Angela stopped her by the door. "You're doing good work here," Angela said. Charlotte smiled faintly. "I'm trying," she replied. Angela's expression softened. "That's all any of us can do," she said. "Keep trying. And sometimes, that's enough." Blank. Underscore. Blank. As Charlotte walked to her car, the air crisp and cool around her, she thought about how far she had come since that flight. She wasn't the person she had been then, rigid, defensive, certain of her own infallibility. But she wasn't the person she wanted to be yet, either. She was somewhere in between. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The seminar room was larger than Charlotte Graham had expected, its high ceilings and wide windows lending an airy, open feel. Rows of chairs stretched out before her, most of them already occupied by an attentive audience. It was a diverse crowd: young professionals, seasoned managers, educators, and community leaders, all gathered to learn about fostering inclusivity in their workplaces and lives. Charlotte stood near the podium, smoothing the hem of her blouse. Her notes rested on the lectern, though she had read them so many times she barely needed them. This was her first time speaking at a public seminar, and the weight of the moment was not lost on her. But it wasn't the size of the crowd that unsettled her. It was the knowledge that she was about to share a part of herself she had spent years trying to avoid. Angela Davis, the director of Pathways to Equity, stood nearby, offering an encouraging nod. "Just be yourself," she said quietly. "Your story is what they came to hear." Charlotte took a deep breath. Stepping up to the microphone, the room quieted, a soft hum of anticipation settling over the crowd. Blank. Underscore. Blank. "Good evening," Charlotte began, her voice steady but low. "Thank you for being here tonight. I'd like to start by telling you a story about failure, reflection, and the long road to change." She paused, glancing out at the faces before her. Some were expectant, others cautious, but all were listening. "For 15 years, I worked as a flight attendant for a major airline," she continued. "It was a job I took pride in. I believed I was good at it not just because I could handle the logistics of the role, but because I thought I treated everyone fairly. I thought my professionalism was enough to ensure that I was doing the right thing." Charlotte's hands rested lightly on the edges of the lectern. "But one flight changed everything for me." She described the Turners, their calm composure, the quiet dignity with which they endured her subtle but deliberate slights. She explained how her assumptions had shaped her actions, how she had convinced herself she was enforcing order when, in reality, she was enforcing bias. "I didn't see them for who they were," she said, her voice softening. "I only saw who I thought they weren't. And because of that, I failed them not just as a flight attendant, but as a person." Blank. Underscore. Blank. As Charlotte spoke, the room remained silent, her words sinking into the stillness like stones dropped into deep water. She didn't dramatize the story, she didn't need to. The weight of it came from its simplicity, its honesty. She described the meeting in the VIP lounge, the Turners' measured words, and the quiet but piercing way they had forced her to confront herself. "They asked me a question I couldn't answer at the time," Charlotte said, glancing briefly at her notes. "They asked me what I had learned in my 15 years of service. And the truth was, I hadn't learned enough. I had been so focused on maintaining control, on upholding a certain standard, that I hadn't stopped to question whether that standard was fair or whether it excluded people who deserved to be there as much as anyone else." Blank. Underscore. Blank. Charlotte shifted slightly, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "That moment was a turning point for me," she said, "but it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a much harder journey, one of reflection, accountability, and change." She described the workshops, the books she had read, the conversations she had with Evelyn and Angela. She shared how she had begun volunteering with Pathways to Equity, using her own story as a tool to help others see the quiet ways bias could creep into their actions. "I've learned that change isn't about perfection," she said. "It's about consistency. It's about being willing to examine yourself, to admit when you're wrong, and to do the work to be better." Blank. Underscore. Blank. As she neared the end of her speech, Charlotte paused, her hands steady on the lectern. "I'm not here to tell you that I've figured it all out," she said. "I haven't. I'm still learning, and I expect I always will be. But what I do know is this: the work matters. Even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable." She let the words settle before continuing. "We all have moments when we fall short. When we act out of fear, or ignorance, or habit. But those moments don't have to define us. What defines us is what we choose to do afterward." Blank. Underscore. Blank. The room was silent for a moment after she finished, the weight of her words lingering in the air. Then, slowly, the audience began to applaud. It wasn't thunderous or raucous, it was steady, warm, and genuine. Charlotte stepped back from the microphone, a quiet sense of relief washing over her. Angela met her by the side of the stage, her smile wide and reassuring. "You did it," she said. Charlotte nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "It felt right," she said quietly. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As the audience began to file out, a few people approached Charlotte to thank her. One woman, older and soft-spoken, took her hand. Your story reminded me of something I went through years ago, she said. It's good to know it's never too late to change. Charlotte's chest tightened, but she nodded. It isn't, she said. Not if we're willing to try. Blank. Blank. That night, as Charlotte drove home, the city lights blurred softly through the windshield. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the mistakes, the lessons, the moments of doubt and growth. She thought about the Turners, their quiet strength, and the way they had held her accountable without cruelty. She thought about Evelyn, who had helped her begin this work, and Angela, who had given her the space to continue it. And for the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt something she hadn't dared to hope for: peace. Her story wasn't finished. It never would be. But she was moving forward, one small step at a time. And for now, that was enough.